transcendental method. He looked at the problems of truth and how we attain it. And he asked this simple question. Not, is there such a thing as knowledge? But he said this, if knowledge is possible, what would there have to be in order to make it possible? In that sense, he's transcending the problem. In that sense, he's cutting the Gordian knot, and he's saying, okay, I don't know whether we can get knowledge or not get knowledge, but if knowledge is possible, how would we proceed? What things would be necessary in order to achieve it? And he said, well, Locke was right, and the empiricists were right, that all of our knowledge of the external world begins with experience. So if science is going to be possible, we are dependent, for better or for worse, upon sense experience as our starting point for knowledge. And so the beginning of knowledge is sensations. Now, he disagreed with Descartes and the history of rationalists who believed that we are born with certain innate ideas. Like Plato argued that we have these ideas with which we're born, and all we have to do is stimulate the memory to recall or to recollect those eternal ideas. For Kant, there are no innate ideas, but there are elements that can be called a priori. Remember that technically speaking, the term a priori does not mean before birth. It means before experience. And so Kant is saying that even though we don't have any content of knowledge at birth, we do have a priori categories that are categories of the mind, categories that make it possible for us to know things before experiencing them. For example, principles like the law of causality, principles like the law of non-contradiction are not learned from experience, but nevertheless, they are not something that we're born with in terms of a content of concepts, but rather they are rational categories, rational abilities that are built into the mind. So sometimes people try to diagram Kant's approach to knowledge and speak of his sausage grinder, epistemology, where there is this funnel at the top where you put the sausage in, and that's the sensations. So you get these impressions and these sensual experiences, and they go into the funnel of the sausage grinder. But before anything can come out of the sausage grinder, these sensations have to work through the categories of the mind, so that the mind is processing these raw sensations. And not only that, for us to be able to have any meaningful perception of the external world, we always perceive of the external world in terms of things or objects that are in space and time. But do we ever have a sensation or a direct perception of space or a direct perception of time? I was in a conversation just the other day with a young man who was asking me what time was. And I said, I don't know. I said, we can define it in terms of as some kind of motion of consecutive moments or consequential moments or sequential moments. And I said, but I can't conceive of time except by the relationship of motion to something physical. How do we tell time? We have clocks, a physical object, and we have numbers on the face of the clock, and then we have these different hands moving, like the second hand. And I'll often have people stand in front of a clock, and I'll say, it's now 12 o'clock noon, and you see the second hand up at the 12, and I said, look down now at the 6. And the second hand is moving towards that, the second hand, here's the 12, and here's the 6, and here's the second hand, and it is moving in this direction. And I'll say, look at the 6, and you're looking at the future. But it hasn't arrived yet. Sort of like what goes on in the countdown at Times Square on New Year's Eve when people give the final 10-second countdown. The 6 here remains future, and this hand sweeps down across the dial, and you'll have this sense of anticipation as we get closer and closer and closer to that future moment that is the 6. And then as it comes down here, it goes right past it, and I said, there it goes, it's gone. That which a moment ago was future is now past. And we talk about living in the present, but the present seems to be hanging there, suspended between the past and the future, because we can't freeze it. It won't stand still. It keeps moving. And so, how other ways do we measure time? You have water clocks, sundials, sand clocks where the sand is sifting through this hourglass. Every way that we have to tell time in our normal experience is by watching some kind of movement between at least two objects. So for us to have a sense of time, we have to have matter and we have to have motion. And that always raises the philosophical question, what time was it the day before creation? Remember, Augustine was asked the question, what was God doing before he created the universe? And his reply was he was creating hell for curious souls. But I mean, people like to speculate about the timelessness of God and the timelessness before time. Was there time before there was a world and motion? It's an interesting question. Again, we don't perceive it, nor do we perceive space purely, because to have a perception of pure space would be to perceive nothing, and nothing is imperceptible. And this was part of the question that Hume was struggling with, if you recall, when he was asking the question, how can I have a distinct impression of a distinct sensation? Why, when I'm standing before an audience, don't I just experience an inchoate, undifferentiated blob of sensations bombarding my eyes and my ears? How is it that I can distinguish the difference between music and noise? There has to be some kind of discrimination, some ability to sort things out and to perceive these sensations in an orderly way. Now, is that because there really is order out there and I'm perceiving an orderly universe, or is it all chaos, all cacophony? But as I experience this chaos and all this noise, the noise of the sensation comes into the categories of my brain, am I creating order out of disorder as a human being? Well, how is it that I can have a discrete sensation of something in space and time when I have no direct sensation of space and time? Well, Kant said, well, you have to have space and time in order to be able to have a perception. And so he spoke of space and time as what he called pure intuitions. That is, so now we have the rational categories, the empirical sensations, and intuition working in this epistemology. And once we get all through this meat grinder, what comes out the end is knowledge. So, do we know that this knowledge absolutely corresponds to reality? No, we don't. Now, Kant says, instead of defining truth as that which corresponds to reality, Kant declared that truth is a judgment. And he distinguished among different types of judgments, different kinds of judgments. Judgments that are a priori, that is, before experience, and judgments that are a posteriori, that comes with or through experience. And then he distinguished between two other kinds of judgments, what he called analytical judgments and synthetic judgments. Now, you recall that we've used this language before. An analytical statement is a statement that is true under analysis. It is true by definition. An analytical statement would be, a bachelor is an unmarried man. There's nothing in the predicate that isn't already in the subject, so that you know the predicate without ever having to experience it. It's true by definition. So in that case, an analytical judgment could be a priori. That is, without ever experiencing a particular man to see if he's married or not. If you say that the man is a bachelor, you already know that he's not married because the term bachelor means unmarried. Well, working through these, synthetic statements are those statements where we learn new information. The bachelor is rich. Riches don't necessarily coincide with bachelorness, and so you can find a bachelor that's poor, or you can find one that's rich, but you can't know whether the bachelor is rich or poor without having an experience of that bachelor. So far, so good. But he said that there are synthetic statements that are a posteriori, but also synthetic statements that are a priori. And that created a firestorm of controversy among later philosophers, because they were arguing that any concrete information must depend upon experience. But Kant, for example, argued that the knowledge that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. He said, we know that before we're experiencing it. And yet the concept straight line does not have within it the idea of shortness of distance. It only is a quality of direction. And so the debate goes on. But in any case, all of this is working together to reconstruct philosophy, to borrow necessary ingredients from empiricism, necessary ingredients from rationalism, put them together in a synthesis that now makes it possible to proceed. But the proceeding of knowledge is limited only to that arena where we have access by sensation.